Welcome to the next section on our series on minerals, and this section is going to cover calcium and phosphorus. We're going to start by talking about calcium. Calcium is the most abundant mineral in the body, and when most people hear about calcium, they definitely think of bone. And bone mineralization is one of calcium's main roles, and calcium is stored in the bone, which is why it's the most abundant mineral in the body. But calcium also has a number of other roles, including nerve transmission, transport of ions, blood pressure, blood clotting, and muscle contraction. The body keeps calcium within the bloodstream under really tight control. Doesn't let it get too high or too low. In general, what happens is we consume food with calcium. Calcium is absorbed into the bloodstream. Now that will elevate the calcium a little bit. If that's the case, calcium can be used to mineralize bone. But if calcium levels drop, then absorption rate within the intestines actually increases, pulling more calcium into the bloodstream. In addition, bone is actually broken down and calcium is released into the bloodstream to bring the level of blood calcium back up to its normal range. There are a number of sources of calcium, and I think most of us think of dairy when we think of calcium, and you can see it at the top of the list here. We have milk and yogurt. Now I want to point out most adults will need about 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day. And if you remember back what our definitions of good source and high in are, 10 to 19% is a good source. That means that 10 to 19%, that means that 100 milligrams of calcium or more will be a good source per serving, and 200 milligrams or more would be high in. That means per serving that food or food product would be high in calcium. So yogurt definitely gets a star, milk gets a star, but also look at collard greens. And they're going to be up there as well. Canned salmon, that's with the bones, 180 milligrams, so this is definitely a good source, along with calcium set tofu. Most tofu is actually set in calcium, so you can pretty much rely on calcium to be a good source. The American cheese, I don't recommend eating American cheese. It's highly processed and doesn't really resemble cheese, but it is a good source, as is cottage cheese. Black-eyed peas as well. There are other sources of calcium that, what I want you to get from this is that there are other sources of calcium, and the next slide is going to show you even more sources that can give you enough calcium without eating dairy products. So if you can eat dairy, and a lot of people can't, don't feel like you have to rely on that or on supplements to obtain enough calcium. Now I put these down here. These are not technically good sources, but they're sources of calcium, but they don't fit our definition. So soy milk, a lot of people always say oranges are a good source of calcium. They're really not. Almonds do have calcium, but you certainly have to eat a lot of them to get enough of the calcium. This chart, actually, this is from a study from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, looking at the bioavailability of calcium. What that means is how much calcium is actually absorbed from the food. And you might be surprised by this. We use milk as our comparative, so everything is compared to milk, and milk has 300 milligrams of calcium per serving. So remember, 200 milligrams or more would be 20%. That would be a high in. So this is high in calcium. So everything is related to milk. So let's start by looking at some milk products, similar milk products. Cheddar cheese is 300, cheese type foods, that's not real food, but cheese foods, yogurt, and then we talked about our calcium with tofu. These are all sources of calcium. You can see they're in between the 250 to 300 range. And look over here. How many servings would you need to eat of each of these foods to equal one serving of milk? You need about one. For each of these, you need about 1 serving to equal a serving of milk. So that means it actually equals 300 milligrams of calcium because of the rate it's absorbed. Well, let's look at some of the cruciferous vegetables. So in particular, they have the Chinese cabbage and Chinese mustard greens. And these actually will have a, look at this, a low 200s for how many milligrams of calcium per serving. Remember, milk has 300 milligrams per serving. But you only need to eat 1 serving to equal 300 milligrams of calcium in milk. And what that means is that even though they have lower levels of calcium to start with, they're absorbed at a greater rate. So you're getting the same amount of calcium actually absorbed into the bloodstream as you would with milk, even though it starts out with a lower amount of calcium. Now, if we go up to bump up to some of the different beans, beans do have some calcium. Only the white beans really are a reasonable source, a good source, but you need to eat 4 servings to equal 1 serving of milk. And then spinach. Spinach is, looks like a good source of calcium, 115 milligrams. So it's not quite as high as this, but how many servings do you need to eat to equal 1 cup of milk? 1 serving of milk. 16. So even though it looks like spinach is a good source of calcium, just based on how many milligrams it has per serving, it's actually not a good source because it has low bioavailability. It doesn't get absorbed well. So in your diet study, if you're low in calcium and you say you're going to add spinach, I'm not against adding spinach to your diet, but you're definitely not going to be increasing your calcium by eating spinach. The same is true for rhubarb, and although sweet potatoes aren't really a good source, you can see the same type of thing happens. There are enough inhibitors in there to limit the absorption of calcium. Now, a few things on phosphorus. Phosphorus and calcium go together because they're both important in the formation and the mineralization of bone, also in teeth. But phosphorus is also part of phospholipids. Now, what's a phospholipid? If you can remember back to chapter 5, we have a triglyceride and then 3 fatty acids. And that would be our triglycerol, a glycerol background and 3 fatty acids. But if you replace 1 fatty acid with a phosphate, you get a phospholipid. Now remember, phospholipids will, they act as emulsifiers. They also are part of cell membranes. They do help allow fat to travel in an aqueous or liquid environment such as the bloodstream. Phosphorus actually also acts as a buffer and in the release of energy. Remember back from biology, hopefully you remember from biology, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. When you lose one of these phosphates and make ADP, there's a release of energy. Here are some sources of phosphorus, some food sources. Some of them you'll notice are similar to calcium, like yogurt and milk, but also some other sources, animal sources, chicken and beef, salmon, and then lentils and almonds as well. Well, this is going to conclude the section on calcium and phosphorus, and the next section we'll talk about osteoporosis.